Welcome to another episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. My name is Usama, and I'm here, as always, with my two brothers, Karim and Sadi. And we have a very special guest today, our father, Dr. Samir Makdisi, a professor emeritus at the American University of Beirut, and also a man who's lived his entire life working in public service and in education, trying to sort of create a better Lebanon. And here we are in 2025, and I guess the first question we wanted to ask our father is, Dad, what is the history of Makdisi Street, the actual street? Can you tell us a little bit about the history of this street?
Well, if I recall correctly, I think this was discussed between my father and my uncle Julius, that since the Makdisi family has been living on John Dark Street for a long time, and then the street adjacent to the John Dark Street was called the Makdisi Street. They thought that they would request, or the municipality decided that it should be called the Makdisi Street in honoring the Makdisi family in Ras Beirut.
And just for our listeners who don't know what Ras Beirut is or what Ras Beirut signifies, what does Ras Beirut mean in the history of Beirut? Yeah, obviously contemporary Beirut, 20th century Beirut. What is it? If you say Ras Beirut, what does that mean culturally, socially, politically, and so on? What does it signify?
Well, I mean, definitely the first idea that comes to mind is the fact that AUB is there, the American University of Beirut, other colleges populated in Ras Beirut. It made it sort of a center for education. I think this really characterized Ras Beirut, differentiated it from other parts of Beirut. People would come to Ras Beirut not only from Lebanon, but from outside Lebanon, from all the Arab world, to come and study at AUB, at LAU, at the College Portston, and so on. So it was really a center for education. This is really what characterized Ras Beirut. And then it was a place where families. It was not as populated as it is now. It was really a residential area, by whatever this word means, a real residential area. So this is really what characterized Ras Beirut, a center for education, American University of Beirut, LAU, college, and so on, that really differentiated it from the other parts of Beirut and Lebanon.
So, Dad, I want to push this further and ask you, Ras Beirut is also, as far for all of us, has also been a place of coexistence in a way in Lebanon, Lebanese history, and even the larger Arab history. So it's been a place where all the different religious or sectarian groups have lived, but also different classes as well. Different kinds of social groups have long lived. So can you talk more about that? And at the same time, how has it changed? I mean, you were born, at a certain period in the interwar period, in the mandate period in Lebanon. What did Ras Beirut look like? And then how has it sort of changed from that time?
Well, I think you put it nicely, Kareem. It is a place where religious groups coexisted peacefully. In fact, if I remember correctly, the question of religion never arose. I mean, one never felt that I'm a Christian or a Muslim or a Shia, or in fact, there are that many Shia in Ras Beirut. The issue of religion did not come to the fore. It was more because of AUB and other education institutions. What occupied attention were national issues, Arab issues, questions for liberation, Palestine, and so on. So the issue of religion, of coexistence, it was taken for granted. There was no problem, no issue. It was as it is now. We never thought of ourselves as being Christian or not Christians.
Yeah, this was even in my days when I was in IC in school.
It never arose.
Middle school and high school in the 70s and 80s, throughout
Yes.
the 80s. I recall we didn't particularly think about that. Everybody partook in different religious things, but
Right.
it wasn't
Right.
something. It wasn't a main identity.
I think Ras Beirut was characterized by the fact that there was a coexistence of religions without the feeling that there were different religious groups. People felt that they were Lebanese first, they were Beirut, they were Ras Beirutis first. I think there was a Ras Beirut identification. the people in Ras Beirut identified themselves being different from the people in Ashrafiyeh or elsewhere. They identified as the Ras Beirutis first, Lebanese perhaps second. So the question of religion, to my knowledge, to my remembrances, never arose as an issue, as is the case now.
Even though we know that that of course people were very pious in many instances, including the people for whom Makdisi Street was named after. You mentioned Jirius and his younger brother Anis, who were two. Could you tell us a little bit more about these two individuals? In other words, your father and your uncle. Could you tell us more about why were they honored by having a street named after them, which of course is the name of our podcast as well?
Well, I mean, I will have to admit that father was a very well-known scholar of Arabic literature. So that's one reason why it was named after our Julius's older brother, of course, was also known, but not as well known as father. So I think the fact that father was a very well-known Arab scholar, not only in Lebanon, but in the Arab world, sort of helped push the idea that the street should be named after the family. In recognition, I mean, this was sort of honoring the Makdisi family. In a sense, honoring father and his brother Julius to a lesser extent.
But you also have, I mean, just to expand it, you also have quite a prominent women in the Makdisi family, right?
Yes. Warad Urtas was a well-known principal of the Ahliya College. Amini Makdisi, the sister of my father, had a school, which I attended as a youngster.
What kind of school?
It was an elementary school on what is now Makdisi Street. It was also a well-known school.
But was it common for a woman in this case to head a school like this?
No, but Amini Makdisi was different. And
Dad, when was that? When was Auntie Amini's school there? Roughly.
we're talking about as a youngster, it must have been in the late 40s and late 40s.
And it was a school that was open, of course, to people of all religions, right? To all,
Absolutely.
I mean, Muslims and Christians.
Absolutely.
And Jews and
But
others.
it was, I must admit, it was mostly a school for girls. The boys in the school were few. People from Ras Beirut, but mainly it was a school intended for girls.
Dad, I remember during the Civil War, early on, like 75, 76, I remember you being involved in, there's two memories that I have of that moment. One is, I mean, I have many memories, but about the family. One is you were involved in a lijni, a committee, something about, it was like a secular, was like a movement, a secular movement or something like that. I remember there was a commit. I remember there being a lijni of some kind.
Ras Beirut.
Yes, that's what it was. Like, so Ras Beirut, a unified committee for Ras Beirut. So tell us a little bit about what the function of that committee was. This would have been in 75, 76.
Well, I mean, the intention in forming this committee, which included Munir Shamma'a and Dr. Abu Haider and other people from AUB, that we wanted to go beyond religious differences, that this was a secular movement, that Lebanon is basically a secular country.
This is when, sorry, but which period are we talking about now?
75.
Okay,
During
75,
the war,
70.
yeah, this was in 70.
So just after the Civil War begins.
Yes. And we wanted to, I mean, the objective of it to see that the Lebanese are unified and that religion is not a factor of division among the Lebanese. It was a very secular thing, but it was, I must admit, it was basically run by people that are associated with AEB or in Ras Beirut. We had a few people from other parts of Beirut, from Ashrafiyeh and so on, but basically it was a Ras Beirut secular-oriented organization.
And sorry, just to follow up on that, one of my other memories from that moment too was a movement for those our listeners who don't know this. Lebanese identity cards, state-issued identity cards, listed. Maybe they still do list, but so they certainly listed when we were growing up. Ones religious background on the Hawi, on the identity card. And remember, there was a movement in the same period, 75, 76, to
in which
delete it or
we
to
asked to be that the religious identification on the car be removed.
Yeah.
And we asked the government that it should be removed. They said that no, this was a problem because this was a constitutional issue that has to go a municipality issue. But yes, there was a demand that the identification of religion on the cars ought to be eliminated. This was because part of the fact that people in Ras Beirut were pushing for a secular state. Secularism was the primary objective of the movement.
But that you were a student at AUB in the 1950s, correct?
Yes.
And in the 1950s, you participated. I remember you telling me this and showing me, in fact, a famous photograph in demonstrations against the Baghdad Pact, which was an imperial colonial pact to basically get the various Arab states to ally in an anti-communist pact when the Arab peoples were basically saying that our main enemy in this part of the world are not the communists as much as the Zionists in Israel. And so can you tell us a little bit more about your experience as a student at AUB, but also, from today's vantage point, 2025, when there's so much despair in the Arab world, how do you reflect back on that moment in the 1950s when it seemed that protests against imperialism and colonialism seemed to be the popular thing to do at the time?
Osama, I have to recall, as a student at AUB, there were three political movements. The Arab nationalists, who believed that the Arab world should be unified in one state. There was a leftist movement that included both the communist-oriented, parties, and the Syrian Ba'ath, the Ba'ath party. These were, and then you have the Qawmiyyah Syrian, the Syrian Nationalist Party was also very, very active at the time. These were the three main political groups at AUB.
What about the Phalangists?
No, the Phalangists were not strong at AUB. The Phalangists belonged more to the other side of Beirut. There were, but they were minor. They didn't really have an influence. They were basically an Ashrafi.
So it was largely leftist and nationalist orientation. So it was largely leftist or nationalist.
No, well,
or Arabist.
The Arabists did not have a political ideology. Their only ideology was that we should have a unified Arab world. In contrast with the socialists and communists who really had identified communist, leftist ideology. So there was a struggle between the two politically. In student elections, they ran against one another, but most it was the Arab nationalists who won, not the leftists. The leftists were able to win, but they never formed a majority in the Student Council. It was basically the Arab nationalists that formed a majority in the Student Council. Now, we used to go down, I remember we used to go down, shouting slogans against American imperialism, against Israeli aggression.
Like what?
تسقط إسرائيل. تسقط إسرائيل تحيا الأمة العربية or something like that. We used to go downtown to the Burj, and mostly we were accompanied by the police forces. We rarely had a clash with the police. At one point at AUB, we were demonstrating at the medical gate. You can see my photos being, shot at the medical gate. Sometimes we used to clash with the police force because as a student body, we wanted to get out of the medical gate, and the police force was given orders to prevent us from getting out. So a clash would occur. And at one point, one of our student brothers was killed right in front of me. He was next to me, and he was shot and killed
by the police.
By the police, by the gendarme. Yes, so-called the gendarme. But often we were permitted to march down the street to the Burj without any problem, and we used to shout all these kind of slogans: "Long live Palestine," "Freedom for the Arab world," "Kick out the foreign forces," and so on. And it was a very nationalistic Arab nationalistic atmosphere, slogans. The divisions in Lebanon were not very apparent. The people in the eastern side of Beirut were sort of on their own. We really never had any direct contact with them. We were sort of, Ras Beirut was something on its own, belonging, its orientation was more the Arab world rather than the rest of Lebanon. Whereas the people in San Joseph, I guess, I would think, had a different orientation altogether. But there was not much of a connection between the Beirut, between AUB students and the San Joseph students. But don't forget that AUB was a dominant university then, not the San Joseph. AUB was it. Everybody wanted to come to AUB from all over the Arab world and from Europe.
So in the Arab nationalist sentiment, this included, of course, the Christians. There
It was very strong.
as you were saying before in Ras Beirut, I mean, there wasn't this issue of Christian Muslim.
No.
It was
No, I mean, the Lebanese politics was not an issue.
so in between the police or the state and the students, you also have the AUB administration. So there's always this, up until today, there's always a kind of these.
Right.
It can play various roles. And in your days, and we're talking now again, we're talking the 60s, 70s. What kind of 50s? What 50s, 60s?
What was
and
all
on.
of the administration?
Yeah, the American, let's say, an American-dominated administration that certainly was not pro-Arab or pro-nationalist or certainly not leftist. So what was the role? Did they stop you? Did they?
As a student, I don't recall that AUB administration really interfered very much in what the students were doing. In any case, even if they were to interfere, they would not been able to do anything about it because there were very strong nationalist movement among the students, both Lebanese and non-Lebanese. Don't forget there were many non-Lebanese students at AUB, Syrians and others. And I do not recall that the administration actively interfered to stop any demonstrations at AUB. Medical Gate was a center for student organizations gathering to go down, walk down all the way to the Burj.
So that, but I mean, when you say that, but AUB's administration, as Karim was saying, in the 1950s was known to be anti-communist and was known to actually blacklist students. And you have your own particular history with in terms of clashing with or at least being sort of having episodes with the administration. Do you want to shed some light on that? And also another question related to what Karim was saying earlier: how important was Palestine for students in the 1950s?
Very. Palestine was extremely important for student body.
Wow.
And yes, of course, there were attempts on the part of the American embassy to stop student activity, but I don't think they succeeded. In fact, I myself, as you very well know, as a result of my student activity, I was denied a visa to go and study at Columbia.
Although you eventually received it.
Eventually, after a number of interventions on the part of many people, including Mr. Salm, who was a CIA officer who came and interviewed me. We used to sit together for many an hour to see who is this fellow who they claim is a leftist and dangerous fellow to go to the U.S. Why was he prevented? Why was I denied a visa by Mr. Bone? I will never forget his name. Mr. Bone at the embassy, when I went to see him, he told me, people like you will never go to the U.S. I will never forget his words. I never forget his words. And then Mr. San came. He was a very nice, gentle fellow from the CIA to see who was this Samir Makdisi, who was causing such a big problem to the U.S. government. And we had many a talk, mostly intellectual talk. And he found out, in fact, that, I'm not a very dangerous person, and he recommended to the U.S. Embassy that I be granted the visa. That's finally I was able to go to Columbia a year later.
On a different topic that you've referred a few times now to the medical gate at AUB,
Yes,
and to the Burj, which many people listening to the show won't know where the medical gate is on AUB campus and what its relationship is to the Burj, to downtown, the old historic center of Beirut. So tell us a little bit about where the medical, I mean, that's not so important, I guess, where the medical gate is, but what its relationship is to the Burj and what the Burj meant in the 1950s, 60s. I mean,
Well, I mean,
when the war started in 1975, I was 11 years old. I mean, I remember a little bit of the old Burj, but not much, because that's where so much of the fighting took place. But what did it mean in your day in the 50s and 60s?
well, I mean, the Burj was the center of Beirut. This is where everything took place. All the big shops and big magazines were in the Burj. I mean, Ras Beirut was simply a residential area. It didn't have very many shops. Medical gate was sort of the entry, was the starting point that leads to the Burj. Don't forget that the main gate goes to Street, whereas the medical gate leads to it goes downtown.
Yeah, so the medical gate is on the eastern side of
Eastern
campus,
side,
facing
that's right.
heading towards downtown.
This is from where you lead your demonstrations to go to the Burj. The Burj was the center of activity in Beirut. It was Beirut. Burj was Beirut.
But yeah, then I was going to also ask, what are your memories of the Burj? I mean, I remember, for example, not just the shops, I also remember the services and taxis filling up
Right.
in the center to go to, and buses and whatnot to go to different parts of the country. It seemed, I mean, my memory of it, my childish memory of it, is that it was like the hub, not just of Beirut, but of the entire country. In many
all the
ways.
main shops and magazines of Beirut were within the Burj. It was the main commercial center where everybody went to shop.
Also, where the buses were, the main bus centers, the main trams. There was the trams that would
That's
come
right.
in
If you
and
want to go up to the mountains, if you want to go up to anywhere in Lebanon, you'd go and find the buses or the taxis in the Burj. This was the place where you go to if you want to go anywhere in Beirut. In Lebanon, you'd go to the Burj to take your taxi or take the bus.
So there was a mix of classes in
And
the
not
Burj.
only, but of course, the commercial center was where now is the shopping mall where where to the left on.
The malls, the downtown, the Rue Solidaire, all this.
Where Solidaire is now, this was the downtown.
For those of our audience who don't know, after the war, downtown central Beirut was reconstructed and it was privatized. People were people who used to rent or own property were essentially dispossessed, and the whole large area of central Beirut was privatized, given over to one company close to the prime minister at the time, and turned into this. It turned into this kind of privatized space of real estate speculation and shopping malls and things like that. It lost its sense of what it had been in Dad's day.
I was about to ask about the different classes, social classes. So, Ras Beirut was basically in our kind of Ras Beirut. It was a kind of middle class, professional classes, certain kinds of families, mixed. What about the kind of, let's say, lower classes? And then the connection, as Sari was saying, with the Burj and the downtown. Clearly, that was a place where all the different classes mixed, and again, where the transport hub was, where the shopping hub, where the souks, or everything was. How were these interactions at the class level in that sense?
Let me try to answer this difficult question. Where Hamra is now, Shar al-Hamra, was of course nothing but a very small street, and there were nothing but gardens there. Basatin, all over Ras Beirut. Ras Beirut was basically Basatin.
Orchards.
Yeah.
Gardens.
I don't know how to say it, but I being, our family, my father being a well-known professor, we were somewhat little different from the rest of the Ras Beirut families. In the sense that they felt that we were a bit different. We were a university family, that academic family, whereas most of the others were either shop owners or merchants or something like that. So there was a differentiation. And people looked at my father with a little bit of respect. That this is Anis Makdisi, Ustaz Anis, meant something to the people there because of his association with AEB, and he's been a well-known professor of Arabic. So But at the same time, the people who were lived in Ras Beirut were, some of them were sort of fallahin. You know, they were shop owners, or had the gardens of Ras Beirut. Now that they planted gardens in Ras Beirut. So there was a differentiation, yes, and I could feel that we were different. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but I could feel that as a family, we were a bit different from the rest of the Ras Beiruti families. Associated with AUB, yes, but also the fact that my father was well known put us in a class a bit different from other Ras Beiruti families.
So it's interesting that you're talking about social capital. You had social capital because of the association with AUB, because of the education, because of the fact that our grandfather, your father, Anis, was so famous as a professor of literature and a poet, but mostly as a professor of literature, and had standing across in the Arab world as well. Yet, how do you reconcile that when you think back on this today? How do you reconcile that with the fact that you gain prestige by being associated with AUB, and that the United States was, and of course remains, at the heart of so much of the imperialism in this part of the world? How do you reconcile? How did you and how do you reconcile that tension between the association with
You
AUB
mean
on the one hand, then and now?
I think now we're going to come.
Okay, then. So let's stick to then.
Well, I mean, it never. The question you raised never occurred to me because we took it for granted that the U.S. was an imperial. There was imperialism, and we as students had to find imperialism. I found uh, no problem with being associated with AUB, associated with AUB, being the son of my father, at the same time fighting against Western imperialism. To me, there was no. It didn't occur to me that there's any problem. No.
And the relationship with AUB, I want to come back to American University of Beirut. Yes, you may have had this sense of it wasn't an issue, but it was being part of AUB. Where you was that considered to be part of? Well, you're American. You're part of this Protestant American kind of tradition, missionary university that's controlled by an administration that had close connections to CIA, to the State Department, to all these things.
But at the same
Much
time,
later on, John Waterbury wrote an article about how AUB was part of America's soft power. Did you feel
right,
that?
right. But you see, at the same time, as students, this never affected our political ideology. I mean, as students, I was leftist as a student, and the fact that I was at AUB did not stop me from adopting leftist ideas. So, how do you reconcile that with the fact that I was AUB? I don't know how to answer this question.
Is it because, in a sense, because there was a majority of students, or at least a good number of students that were like this, that
Or Arab nationalists?
yeah, that you were empowered in that sense. That
That's
students like you were empowered
right.
to not worry about administration. That perhaps later on, post 1990s, and especially the last 20, 30 years, this relationship has changed a lot
Yes,
in my own experience.
Yes, I think so. I think you're right. You're right about that. I mean, I don't, no doubt at the time that the administration was not in favor of what we did on the streets, and especially when we were shouting slogans against Israel and the US. But I don't think they could do much about it. There's nothing that they could do much about it. But ultimately, of course, it did affect me when I went to go to the US, when they said that you are an undesirable element, undesirable fellow to be given a visa. But nonetheless, they could not stop the students from expressing their wish to demonstrate for Arab causes.
Yeah, the idea of a tolerant university administration it seems so quaint in retrospect. That I wanted to, just moving away from AUB for a little bit, I want to go back to Makdisi Street, the street itself, and Ras Beirut. And I mean, you referred to gardens and orchards and so on in
Right.
Beirut. Anybody who knows Beirut now, especially our part of Beirut,
Nothing but that.
It's but now it's a concrete jungle. It's all not high rises, but mid rises and 11, 12, 13, 14-story buildings. A lot of concrete, very little green. AUB is actually the only sustained green area in our part of Beirut. So what was it like? I mean, when you walk down the streets of Beirut,
It was beautiful, Salim.
okay, so yeah, tell us a bit. So
Absolutely
people who don't
beautiful.
know
I
that
mean, I
Beirut,
used to walk as a youngster. I would go with my father, walk down Jandak Street, go to EB, go to the Corniche.
but what were the streets like? What were the houses like? What was the
Individual houses. There were two-story houses. Two-story. There were no high apartments.
With
This
trees
did
and
not
gardens.
exist, with gardens. But our house was a very large two-story house with the red brick and the garden, and many other houses were like that, both on Jandak, not on Hamra, on Sadat. Hamra was more or less still mostly vegetable gardens. There weren't very many buildings on Hamra. It was not a residential street. I mean, you'd go from Jandak to Sadat. This is, I mean, where my aunt used to live, where the Khouris used to live, where now Abu Talib used to be.
yeah?
Okay, this was the street where they had large, beautiful houses there. But I do not recall. I mean, there were no large apartment buildings.
And if you went beyond Hamra or like sort of towards where the Raushi is now,
Then it
what
was
was that?
wilderness. It was
That's
actually
so
wilderness.
for our time. It's
You were
unimaginable.
out of the city. You were going out in the wilderness. You really get out of the city.
And access to the sea. Because this to me and to us, anybody, the past 20, I mean, the idea of could you access the sea? How was that? Could you swim? Is this, I mean, could one go there without having to pay
No,
money for everything was privatized on the water?
access to the sea was basically through AUB, Kareem. The AUB beach was our access to the sea. The other part of the sea, I've never been there. I never went there. I don't think it was accessible. It was not yet built. But I know that there, if you'd go there, there were no houses. It was just simply hills and trees. It was really
Wild.
wild.
It sounds idyllic compared to today, as Sadi was saying. But Dad, I want to go back, take it in a different direction, and ask you again to elaborate a little bit on when you said that Palestine was important for your
Yes.
generation,
Yes.
as it is, of course, hopefully for many people in our generation. But as a Lebanese, since you grew up in Ras Beirut, your father was, as we've talked and discussed, a professor of Arabic literature who wasn't overtly political in the sense of he wasn't involved in these
Outwardly.
Yes, outwardly. He wasn't involved in these demonstrations. Can you explain, especially to people today in Lebanon and in other parts of the Arab world who keep saying, well, Palestine is not our cause. We don't worry about it. We're done with Palestine. How do you explain why Palestine was so important for your generation in the 1950s?
Well, don't forget, when was Israel established? 48? Well, I mean, we're talking about the 50s. So this was not, the time differential is not that great. It's still, the Palestine issue was the issue.
Why?
There was the issue then. Because still, I mean, it was an unresolved problem. And there were many, don't forget, there were many Palestinian students at EB and many Arab nationalists at EB who believed in the liberation of Palestine. That was a very important political objective. And I should tell you here in passing, I never discussed politics with my parents. I mean, he never knew about my political activity. That was something very private to me. I mean, the fact that I had leftist ideas at the time, that I associated with leftist students at EB, something that my father never knew about. It is something that was very private between me and my colleagues at AUB.
Maybe we can probably turn to the more contemporary period, but a question, the Protestant tradition, just part of the Makdisi Street, the Ras Beirut area, obviously AUB helping to, coming through the American missionaries and created in the mid 19th century. What is how did we become Protestant? And how does that movement sort of...
Let me see whether I can tell you that correctly. If I recall correctly, my grandmother, my father's mother, was the one who converted into Protestantism.
From?
Greek Orthodox. And if I also remember correctly, her husband stayed as a Greek Orthodox until later in life, when he also converted, became a Protestant. So it was my grandmother who began the tradition of our being Protestant. Before that, we were Greek Orthodox from Kura.
Do you know why she converted?
Maybe she was influenced by the mission, by the American mission in Tripoli.
She wanted education?
Partly, I think so. I'm guessing, Osama. I'm guessing.
Okay.
So your father, Anis, was born in Tripoli,
Yes.
actually, and originally in northern Lebanon, and the family before that sort of came from the Kura area,
Right.
correct? And so your father was born in Tripoli, and he. Can you say how you ended up on Ras Beirut and how Makdisi Street ends up?
Yes, I think the American missions saw him as a sort of promising young student, and I think they arranged for him to go from Tripoli to Beirut, and they helped him. They helped him study to finish his education, both elementary and then high school.
Helped him financially.
Financially.
This is your father.
Yeah, my father, and then he, of course, he graduated from AUB. And
where Jirios was, his older brother.
Jirios, Jirios, I don't know whether Jirios was a full-time professor or not. I'm not sure. Someone else has to be asked this question. I mean, Jirios was not as associated with AUB as my father was. And then, of course, my father was offered to become professor of Arabic and then chair of the Arabic department for a very many years, until he retired from AUB at the age of 65.
Which year?
You catch me.
Okay. All right. So just a quick question to go back. You said that your father didn't know about your political activities at AUB.
No, right.
It was a secret.
I mean, he may have known, but I never discussed it with him.
You never discussed it with
yes,
him?
I mean, I think at one point he sort of very gently alerted me not to be overjealous about my political activity.
He was concerned.
But
he was concerned.
Yeah, but it was never a point of discussion at home. My mother never discussed it with me.
What about your brother Nadim?
Nadim was not here.
And
Nadim was abroad.
And your sisters?
They were
your
already
sisters,
married.
Aida, Nida.
Aida was in nursing school when I was young. Nida had already left. She was married. And Nadim I had never seen. I don't recall Nadim at home at all. I mean, I recall growing up, well, at least after the age of 10, growing up alone at home with my parents. Because by the time I was 10, Aida was 17, and she had entered nursing school. And hence, there was nobody at home except my parents and I.
One of our experiences growing up in a I don't know, sort of a hybrid Protestant secular family, because that's how I think of our background. I mean, there's sort of not nominally, it's a more than nominal relationship to Protestantism and to Christianity, but also deeply secular and generally aligned on the left of politics in the family. But we used to, when at least the three of us would sometimes we would go to church, right, with, especially for Christmas and Easter and that kind of thing. And I remember in the hymn book, many of the hymns were
written by father.
Were written by Anis, your father, our
Yes.
grandfather, your father.
Right.
What did that? I mean, as somebody coming from this, as you just said, that atmosphere at AUB of left-wing secular Arab nationalist student movement, to going to church where your father was, half the hymns or whatever the number is in the hymn book were written by your father.
Of course, father, was a believer, but he was not a believer in the traditional sense of the word. That with us, he went to church. He wrote many hymns. He was well known in the church, but he was never one of those people who were
super. He wasn't.
متعصب.
He wasn't. He wasn't.
No, to him it was more of a intellectual endeavor. It was more intellectually.
Was there an element of skepticism? Was he?
Yes. Okay. Yes, there was an element of skepticism. despite the fact that he went to church and he wrote many of the church hymns. Yes,
So,
I think there was an element of skepticism.
so there was no contradiction for him and for you, speaking in your own, there was no contradiction between having a secular nationalist, Arab nationalist kind of
Going to
outlook,
church,
and at the same time being part of the church community, the Protestant church community,
absolutely none.
and being part of the larger,
Yeah.
ecumenical
Absolutely
Ras
none.
Beirut center.
Absolutely none. Absolutely none.
That I mean, you of course, we wouldn't be here if you're not married. Our mother, Jane Saeed, who of
Most
course,
beautiful woman.
no doubt, who of course is Palestinian. What was it like for you to and for the family in general for a Lebanese to marry a Palestinian, and how did that, especially when you go into the years of the Civil War, which year did you get married? And then what was it like to, I mean, there was nothing, obviously, there was nothing unusual about marrying a Palestinian.
62.
62. Okay.
Okay.
So,
Now, of course, don't forget that their family and our family is somewhat in Dur.
Where we are
where
now.
we are now.
Where we are now,
Turishwer
but
is
not
a
here,
town in the mountains of Lebanon
yeah,
where we are.
Turishwer.
This is Turishwer, where we
And
are
I,
now.
of course, they were friends. Her parents and my parents were friendly, and they used to visit. They used to visit one another. And how did I get to know Jean? I mean, Jean is younger than me, as you all know. My elder sister Nida, used to point to Jean and said, "Samir, keep your eyes on the Saeed girl." And I somehow, at one point, I kept my eyes on the Saeed girl, and then ultimately happened what happened. We were married. I mean, this is the way that led to our ultimate marriage. I mean, she immediately fell into love with me.
Wait. Actually, but I actually have a follow up on this because we're going to talk to Mom separately to have a
Yeah.
conversation about
Into fact check.
her memories. No, her memories. Yeah,
Of
fact
how we
checking.
met.
But also, no, her memory also of Turishwer, because for the Saeeds, who are a Palestinian family who came, they would move between Palestine and Egypt, and they would come here in Lebanon in the summers.
They used to live in Egypt, yes.
Yeah, but they moved between Palestine, Egypt, and Lebanon. There was in other words, at that point, it was possible to move between and among Palestine,
Yes,
Lebanon, and
yes,
Egypt,
yes.
and this is
By car, by the way.
by car or
Yeah.
by train or whatever.
Mm.
But this is a question I can't remember ever having asked you. Since if we were to get in the car now, if it weren't for the presence of the
Israel.
baleful ideology of Zionism, if we got in the car now, we could drive in, I don't know, 3 hours or something. We'd be in Haifa.
Right. We lived there less than 3 hours.
Did
yeah.
you ever go to Palestine?
I've never been in Palestine.
Why? And is Palestine and the fight for Palestine separate?
Presumably, I mean, I know from Mom's family stories, it was possible. Lebanon, Palestine, there was the border was open and permeable. So
But she was here. I mean, they used to summer here, and we should meet them here.
yeah,
I mean, there was never a reason for me to go to the West Bank.
not the
No, it's
West
not the
Bank,
West Bank.
Palestine.
Palestine.
Yani Haifa, Akka,
No.
Jaffa, Jerusalem.
There was never, I don't know. I mean, how shall I answer this
Is that because
question?
of the Ras Beirut mentality as well? I mean, Ras Beirut as
No.
well has quite a. It's
Parochial?
it's quite a closed off. I mean, it's funny that there's always this sense of coexistence and all this kind of thing, and class and sect and all this kind of stuff, and open to Arab nationalism, and open to Palestine, and open to global as well, to international and global Western influences, and all sorts of influences. But at the same time, there's always a sense from people outside Ras Beirut that Ras Beirut is also kind of closed,
Yeah.
and certain families, certain kinds of people, certain things, even a certain haughtiness, in a sense, superiority over others, at a certain level. Intellectually, of course, but also socially, I would also say, at certain levels, not just intellectually.
Sure.
So the question of Palestine being both so close, but also, not something that, I mean, did families around you go to Palestine?
No, but
the families around you, did they go to Palestine?
What would take me to Palestine?
What you
I
tell
mean,
me.
Nothing.
I mean, it's true that Palestine fell in. You were 15 or 16 years old when Palestine fell, so it's not like you weren't an adult when there was still when Palestine was still there. So I mean, yeah, that makes sense, I guess.
Dad, I want to ask you, I want to shift the conversation a little bit, or at least build on this conversation, and ask you to go back to the question I asked you about mother, in the sense of you married a Palestinian, and as you said, it was totally normal because they summered here, and there was relations between the families. But then when the civil war began, and I want us to move us to this
75, you mean?
1975, the Lebanese civil war. When it began in 1975, a lot of people and a lot of Christians in Lebanon blamed the Palestinians for the war. So I'm wondering how you, and because we're going to ask our mother this, but how did you navigate? What do you make of that accusation, and how did you feel personally about that?
At the time,
Yes,
at the time, I did feel that the Palestinians were partly to blame. Yes, but I also felt that the Lebanese were also to blame. I mean, I did not think that the cause of the civil war could be attributed to any single party. I thought all of the parties concerned, the Palestinians and the Lebanese, were to blame. It was not. I could not attribute it to the Palestinians, although I thought the Palestinians were a cause. Yes, but I could not attribute it only to the Lebanese. So, to me, it was something that.
By Palestinian, you mean the PLO? You mean the revolution?
I mean the PLO.
The resistance.
I meant the PLO. I mean the PLO. Yes, I mean the PLO. The PLO played a role, no doubt about that. But I could not attribute it simply to the PLO. I also could attribute it to the Kataib,
the Phalangists,
and the Phalange party, that they were all responsible for the civil war.
Yeah, but as Osama was saying, so further than just the question of the PLO, in terms of the way in which, so we're moving from, even at AUB, but sort of socially and across Beirut and across the region, this idea of, I don't know if it's not, not a contradiction, maybe it is, or maybe it's not a contradiction, but support for the Palestinians in terms of the Palestinian cause against Zionism, against the Israelis, against all of this, against imperialism, against colonialism. But at the same time, a sense of Palestinians, the presence of Palestinians in Lebanon, also now starts to become.
Karim, there was a problem.
Even among Christians, and maybe in your family and other places, was there any? Did they ask you, why did you marry a Palestinian? What's this?
No, that's different.
Okay.
To me, the PLO at the time, and we're talking about the 70s, posed a problem. I mean, I was against the idea that the Palestinians should control Lebanon. I was opposed to that intellectually. But at the same time, I was not for the other side of the equation, the group, that they wanted to have some kind of a Christian-oriented Lebanon. So there was a problem. Don't forget that I had leftist ideas, and I wanted a secular leftist Lebanon, free of Palestinian control and free of Kataib control, which was really ideal, which was really unrealistic.
But the state in Lebanon was not controlled by the PLO. The state was controlled by a sectarian system in which, as our viewers and listeners I'm sure know, was dominated, of course, by it was a French established state and polity in which privileges were given to the Maronite Christians.
But we're talking post-independence.
I know, but even after the independence, as you know perfectly well,
but
you as a Protestant are not allowed to become or cannot become president of this republic, or prime minister, or speaker of parliament.
Yes,
which all of these are reserved for various sects, and the Maronites, of course, had the lion's share of power,
including head of the central bank,
including head of the central bank. And the irony, of course, is that at AUB, at the American University of Beirut, because you're Arab, you weren't able to, or you weren't allowed to become president of the American University of Beirut, because that's a different form of prejudice that was operating at AUB at the time. So I'm wondering, when you say it's not the Palestinians and it's not the Lebanese, but surely as what you describe yourself as a leftist, anti-colonial figure, an intellectual, and someone who's worked for a secular Lebanon, the blame in terms of the civil war, there are many factors, obviously, that instigated the civil.
But I think we need to clarify. Do you mean retroactively? No, because that's maybe a separate account to what he was feeling at the time.
No, at the time. He's talking about the time. Yeah. You're saying at the time you felt the fault for the war was both a Palestinian and the Lebanese, but don't you think it's really on the Lebanese establishment that had set up the system that refused to compromise, that refused to relent on an extraordinarily discriminatory system that had no real representation in terms of democratic representation, where people like you, let alone tons of other people in Lebanon, who were excluded from the political process. So don't you think that is where, I'm just wondering how at the time you felt as opposed to today, how you felt in terms of attributing, when you think about what the causes were for the civil war?
Actually, sorry, just to clarify Osama's question, it's not that people didn't have a voice. People had the right to vote, but the executive, the sort of the upper branches of the government, the president, the prime minister, the speaker of parliament, et cetera, was distributed along sectarian lines, right? So you had a right to vote, but you were barred
You
from
didn't have the right to become president.
For example, so it's not. In other words, it's not like this wasn't an autocracy. There were democratic forms. There still are democratic forms of governance, but at the upper levels, they're restricted in terms of sectarian distribution, right? Just to clarify
Yes,
that.
I mean, the fact that there was political discrimination among Lebanese citizens was very clear, but it was something that one couldn't. You fought against it theoretically, in principle, in writings, but in practice, you could not change the system. I mean, you had to accept it that this is the way it was, unless many, in fact, I think a number of Protestants converted into other religion. They left being Protestants, became Greek Orthodox in order to gain political privileges
within the sectarian system.
within
you mean to
the
run for
sectarian
office
system.
and to do things like
But
this.
I must admit that nonetheless, despite the sectarian system, I was able to achieve certain positions I was appointed as a minister in the government, right, in 1992. Despite the fact by being a Protestant, and normally Protestants are not in the cabinet. And at AUB, the most I could do was to be asked to become deputy president of the university. And I remember very well, this was a meeting in Damascus of the Board of Trustees.
Which year?
I was appointed in 1993. This was in late 1992, because I began as deputy president in early 1993.
So this is just after the civil war ends, more or less.
Yes. And I remember very well that David Deutsch came to me and said, Samir, the Board of Trustees would like you to assume the presidency of the AUB as deputy president. But please keep in mind that as Lebanese, only Americans can become a president. I remember very well David Deutsch telling me this, that Samir, keep in mind that the presidency is reserved for American citizens.
Is that in the bylaws of AUB as far as you know? No, it's not.
No, it's not
just,
in the bylaws.
It's an American control issue.
It's a system. A system that only American citizens may assume the presidency of AUB. Hence, I have to be satisfied simply with deputy presidency.
And the student body never protested this.
Sorry?
Even in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the student body never, you say there was a lot of leftist activity, but they never fought that.
No.
The AUB system. And I know when I started to teach, when I was a professor at AUB at the beginning, the student body, this kind of elections that were taking place in the student body was rigged as far as I was concerned. It was, there was a lot of administration and faculty that would be on the wider body, the university kind of student body. And I always found this to be incredible, that they never challenged the electoral law within the system, even though they would complain and protest against the Lebanese national electoral law and make all sorts of stories. But within the structure of AUB, they would not protest.
Right.
I always found that strange. So obviously they didn't in your days either.
No, they didn't.
Yeah. So I think we should maybe go to another chapter, which is the question of your public service, because you had a lot of years. You mentioned being a minister you could talk about the economy and trade. Maybe you could talk a little bit. I also, just before that, you were quite high up on the. You were an economist. You kind of worked a lot
advisory work.
In the advisory, but you were very heavily involved in many things, but in particular in the central bank.
And reconstruction.
In the reconstruction, but the central bank in the 80s, right? So how was that? This working both as a Protestant, you're saying it wasn't, but at one point were you not nominated or thought of as being potentially the governor of the central bank, and then the Maronite forces, who it's the head of central bank is always a Maronite, they're the ones who blocked you? Wasn't there some story like this? So how was that?
The fact that I was a Protestant was against my being appointed to a very high post, right? Okay. But because then the people in the government really wanted my services, they wanted me to be involved, we created something called لجنة التنسيق الاقتصادي. It was created outside. لجنة التنسيق الاقتصادي,
Yeah, Committee for Economic
which
Coordination.
included the governor of the central bank, the president of the council of مجلس الماء والإعمار, the
Council
construction
of
board,
Reconstruction.
included them. We were a group that actually worked together.
Which year is this? Which year we're talking now? In the 80s, right? That we're talking
Yes, we're talking about
in the middle kind
right,
of
right.
end of the
What
Civil War.
Atallah was Muhammad Atallah was a close friend of mine from AUB. He was the head of the reconstruction board, and Michel Khouri was the governor of the central bank, and we worked very closely together to formulate an economic plan for Lebanon. And Salim al-Hus was prime minister. But my position, being a Protestant, we had to create a group, a committee called the لجنة التنسيق الاقتصادي, which meant I was the one who coordinated between all these three groups to bring about an economic plan in Lebanon. That's the way I was involved, being very heavily involved with the.
But you were never. But you were not allowed to be the governor of the central bank at some after Michel
as a
Khouri.
Protestant, no.
As a
I
Protestant,
wasn't allowed. In fact, Salim al-Hus, to be honest, Salim al-Hus did nominate me
yes.
to become the governor of the central bank. Then
In which year we're talking?
Jmail was president.
Amin Jmail.
Jmail.
So in the mid-late 80s.
And Amin Jmail looked. I remember Salim telling me this. He sent me my CV, and he looked, yes, very impressive. But what is religion? I know he's Protestant. I know what? And you want me to nominate him as governor of the central bank? That's where it stopped.
That was the end of that.
That was the end of that.
Just
But actually, Salim didn't nominate me to be governor of the central bank.
So you were heavily involved in economic policy, or at least in thinking about and trying to put forth public policy related to economic policy and perhaps development policy.
Yes.
Both in your work and in very high level support.
I would like to mention Muhammad Atallah, because we work very closely with Muhammad Atallah.
Yeah. So in the central bank, but then also as a minister in one of the first or second governments that was short-lived in
92.
But before Rafiq Hariri comes in, and then it becomes a whole other world. In that thing, what kind of economic policy were you advising? I mean, we're talking about a country, maybe you could tell, in the 50s, 60s onwards, in the post kind of colonial world, it was a very free market ideology that catered towards people on the coast, to the exclusion of people in the countryside.
The Minister of Finance was a friend of mine. And I really was very much involved, not only as a Minister of Economy, but I was really practically dictating to the Minister of Finance what he should do in financial matters. We made up a plan, and we discussed it with the IMF, and I went to Washington at the time.
We're talking about now
92. We discussed it with the IMF, and they thought it was a good plan. We went back here, we started implementing it. Elections took place.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. What was the main strategy or the main points of these kinds of economic? I mean, just broadly speaking, obviously, without the details, because I know we've had a lot of discussions, and I'd like you to push this. What was it that was being pushed in this economic policy versus then what happens when Rafiq Hariri comes in and brings his own people, and sort of it's a whole new world, and what neoliberalism and all these things. What was different?
But let me recall that prior to my becoming a minister, I was a member of a committee, development committee, that included a number of Lebanese economists, that we discussed what ought to happen at the time with Layla Hrawi.
Hrawi was president.
The president. We discussed what ought to be done as economic financial planning, and I took it up when I became a minister. I took it up from there.
I think what Karim is getting at, what were you proposing?
Was it new?
I mean, Lebanon was emerging from
I was preparing
15 years of war. So what was the blueprint that you were?
I mean, I don't recall the details, but I was proposing sort of a combination, an equilibrium between macroeconomic policy and economic growth. Something that will.
In plain English, what does that mean? So was there, if later in the Hariri years onwards, and presumably before the Civil War, there was this free
Kareem,
market and then extreme free market policy.
There was a budget deficit. And part of our plan was to control the budget deficit because that was inflationary. All right. Part of the plan we were working out to not only have economic growth, but to control fiscal deficits. All right. And
accumulated during the Civil War.
Right. Yeah. Correct. Up until 1992.
Right.
It was growing. It was growing fiscal deficits. So part of our plan was to control that fiscal deficit, okay, alongside trying to stimulate economic growth. Then came Rafi al-Hariri.
Well, before Rafi al-Hariri, just in terms of Kareem's question is in terms of your planning, in terms of what about electricity? What about equity? What about redistribution? Was there anything like that in this thinking?
Was it national in the sense of you were in those days considering the whole country after the Civil War?
No, it was no.
Or was it focused on
Beirut? It was
Beirut?
basically macroeconomics.
Yeah.
It was basically a macroeconomic plan. Meaning fiscal, monetary objectives.
There were other ministers who were supposed to be dealing with the other aspects. Right. Okay. And
I was not dealing with what's happening in the south, for example, or
there was a whole different.
And there was income distribution. Was not really a part and parcel of what we were doing.
Okay, and then so the rupture happened. So you were a minister of economy and trade, I think it was.
And I tried to carry out what this committee was doing at the time of before I became a minister.
So it was consultative. It wasn't just you coming up. It
was an official consultative committee formed by the government, and I was trying to carry out some of these reforms we were discussing then. And then came Rafi al-Hariri, and Rafi al-Hariri had his own.
Why were you not involved in the Hariri governments afterwards? Honestly, I mean,
because maybe I was too independent.
Okay, so you didn't want to be part of this.
I don't think he wanted me to be a part of it.
Okay, and so how do you assess then what happened? So we're coming out of a civil war. There was an attempt through
control inflation, to control the budget inflationary.
Okay, and then afterwards, after Hariri, this spirals. This becomes nothing but debt, and then this leads eventually to the collapse, to the economic financial collapse many years later, and the dominance of the banks, and hyper market oriented and privatization and the whole business of Solidaire and downtown.
Because to them, Kareem, then controlling inflation meant that you have to control expenditure and spending. And controlling spending is not also always politically attractive.
No, especially after a war.
So, I mean, you had to sort of try to create a balance between controlling inflation and at the same time not really depriving people from their rights to income.
One last question, I'll hand it to Osama. You said there was a committee. You said there was a lot of
before I became a minister.
Before you became minister, and then where was the opposition at that point? I'm talking about the economic experts, all these kinds of people.
Opposition.
After Hariri, when this incredible different kind of policies come in, and the amount of expenditure increased astronomically, with no taxes and no collection, no income.
When Hariri came, he thought, let's not worry about revenue now. Let's worry about expenditure. Things will grow, the economy will grow, it will revive, and then we can worry about controlling the deficit. His initial move was not to control the deficit.
Yeah, but that also he and his friends benefited enormously from that.
Okay.
I mean, in their capacity as private investors too.
All right. Okay.
But
all right.
You also used to say, I remember very vividly in the Hariri period, that he was the greatest catastrophe in terms of corruption in this country, in economic terms, in terms of just buying out. Wasn't it unprecedented in the history of Lebanon to have this amount of wealth coming into the country, concentrated in an individual, exactly, who was able to basically through Gulf money.
He came. I think, if I'm not mistaken, at least between 2 to 4 billion. He had wealth estimated between 2 to 4 billion dollars. And then, what was the national income of Lebanon then? 6-7 billion? I don't know. So I mean, the proportions were the
Totally out of whack.
So-
It's
But how do you
incredible.
but how do you evaluate, in less technical terms, how do you evaluate Hariri's reign in terms of the policies he adopted, not just the economic policies, but the entirety of the policies that he adopted? How do you evaluate them when you think of in terms of someone, since you yourself were so invested in reconstruction, in saving Lebanon, in a secular idea of Lebanon? How do you evaluate Hariri? Because many people think back. Hariri's government, the whole group, not just Hariri, but the whole group. Because many people have this nostalgic view of Hariri, that it was a great period in Lebanese history in the 1990s. There was reconstruction. There were beautiful buildings. Beirut, was
Starting to reconstruct Beirut.
exactly.
Yes. Yeah, but I don't think he really paid attention to the fiscal side of the equation. And I think he said, let's spend now and worry about revenue later on. I think that Hariri wanted simply to reconstruct, gain popularity by reconstructing, but I don't think he really was. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think his government was very concerned about the overall picture of the Lebanese economy.
And as a result, the debt grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and the banks were out of control. And
Let's worry about. Let's worry about. Let's worry about.
yeah, but we all know where
Let's
that.
worry about the deficit deflation later.
Yeah, but and also the growth of the debt and all that stuff, and then we know where that went in 2019, 2020. Right?
But also importantly, and this just connects back to your role in the central bank. During the Civil War, and then maybe just after, in that period where you were involved in the central bank, but also then became minister. So in those kinds of years, let's say pre-Hariri years and pre-real reconstruction years that come after this, there's also was it unusual that in a sense Riyad Salami, who becomes then the head of the central bank, who was, if I remember, he was a
Hariri's man.
He had worked as an investor, right, for Hariri before that, and Fouad Siniora, who had become Minister of Finance, who also was very close to Hariri. So this triangulation of the Minister of Finance, the head of the central bank, and the Prime Minister, and the head of the CD, the Council for Development and Reconstruction, all of these were quite close and connected as well to a lot of Gulf money that was coming in at the time, and that also brought a huge amount of corruption, right?
And their own private wealth.
And their own private wealth, of course, that then grows exponentially in this sense.
All right. So what's the question? I mean, what is it that you would like to comment?
I mean, can you see? We don't want to put words in your mouth,
Look,
but do you see?
let
Do you
me
see
repeat.
the financial catastrophe that has overcome Lebanon since then? Do you see the seeds being
Look.
laid then, or could there have been a different path that didn't lead us to the catastrophe that came?
When we were in the government, it was a short period, about 6-7 months only. The objective was to control inflation, was to control the financial side of the equation, while at the same time trying to have economic growth. When Hariri came, controlling the budget was no longer a consideration. Let's worry about it later on.
Yeah.
And hence why now we've reached a point after Hariri where we're having a deficit which is uncontrollable.
And the collapse of the currency and
But
the collapse of the banks.
we were saying, I remember with Asad Diab and I were saying, let's try to control the budget deficit and go from there. When Hariri came, the thing was reversed. And why not worry about economic growth? Don't worry about the budget.
Maybe we should start wrapping up here, although that's kind of a gloomy note to end on. But
yeah, I think we should wrap up a little bit, but let's maybe wrap up on what's on today. When we go back to Makdisi Street,
Yeah.
Makdisi Street today looks very different. Even in my days, even over the past couple of decades, just sort of living and working here, it's changed a lot from our childhood to the post-war to the last couple of decades, and especially the last decade. The way it looks has changed, the way it is changed. How do you, and Ras Beirut more generally, is no longer this protected set of a few families and some others kind of working around. It's changed. It's certainly no longer gardens and orchards.
And we no longer live on Jeanne d'Arc.
And we don't live on Jeanne d'Arc, etc. So, how do you see this change? What does this change to you in Makdisi Street, literally, but also Ras Beirut and AUB? Maybe you know.
Kareem, I put it very, very, very briefly. My feeling to Ras Beirut have never changed. I love Ras Beirut. I feel a Ras Beiruti. But no doubt, I feel that Ras Beirut has changed a lot. It is not the Ras Beirut I know. It's a different Ras Beirut.
How so?
By people coming from outside Beirut, populating Ras Beirut. I mean, it's no longer the Ras Beirut of the 50s. But I accept it. And I still feel that when I walk up, by the way, Bliss Street didn't change much. Bliss Street has kept really its characteristics.
Where AUB is.
And even Jeanne d'Arc
where we live.
Street, even Jeanne d'Arc Street is basically the same. It hasn't really changed much. But Hamara is a totally different area. Totally different. At one point, Hamara was the center of activity.
Commercial activity.
And cinemas and so on and so forth.
Cafes and
so on. Now it no longer is. So things have changed. They have shifted to downtown Beirut, to outside Beirut. But Jeanne d'Arc and Ras Beirut has, up to a point, kept its historic characteristics. To a large extent, thanks to AUB.
Okay. So that as we wrap here, as I said, we're in 2025, recording in the summer of 2025. The situation in Lebanon is precarious, catastrophic. The Israeli destruction of huge swaths of Lebanon, the corruption inside of Lebanon, even around here, the garbage crisis, the lack of electricity, the lack of water, all the extraordinary things that we see in Lebanon that are incredibly challenging, as you would say. My question is, and our question, I guess, to wrap is, do you have any regrets having spent so much of your life fighting for a better Lebanon, a more secular Lebanon, a less corrupt Lebanon, when it seems that so many of the sort of robber barons and sectarian warlords and others are the ones who have benefited so greatly and still benefit?
You really want to answer this question? You really want me to answer this question?
Just for the historical record.
No. My only regret is that things did not develop the way I had hoped they would develop. That's my only regret. I don't regret having done what I have done at AUB, in Ras Beirut, and in Lebanon. My great regret is that things did not develop as I had hoped they would. This is my great regret, yes.
Just one last question, which is, you've written a lot about it. So you've lived it, and you've written a lot about the economic policy and development policy. The question is, is there any more, looking forward in a sense? Do you sense that talking in that sense is no longer even viable to think about it, or are we going to be in perpetual crisis, and so therefore it's
Karim, you're a political scientist. Ultimately, the more I think about it, the more I think that it's not a matter of in the hands of the economists. It's really in the hands of political scientists. To the extent...
Certainly not political scientists.
Well, I mean...
Politicians and warlords and external, the Saudis, the Emeritus, the Americans, I don't know, all these,
Give me proper
actors.
governance and the rest follows. Give me proper governance and the rest follows. As long as we don't have proper governance in this country, things will never be the way we hope they would be. Give me proper governance, and I'm not worried about anything else.
And that may be a good place to stop. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for...
Yes.
You want to ask a question?
Yes, as your granddaughter, Jiddo, can I ask you, for your children and grandchildren now, do you have hope for the future of the country?
One should never lose hope, Layla. Never, ever lose hope. Despite all the difficulties one might face in one's country, you should never, ever lose hope.
Thanks, Jiddo.
Thank you.
We should have a data ask a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, ask her whether she regrets marrying me.